We need to talk. In the aftermath of a horrific act of violence, the conversations we have with one another, they're important. The big story this week is an act of political violence that shocked so many people: the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Political violence is wrong, period. No one should die because of their opinion, period. You can disagree with what Charlie Kirk said during his life. No one should celebrate his death, period. No complexity there. Political leaders are now vowing to continue sharing and promoting his views. Now, Kirk is being lauded for encouraging conversations. He's being held up as an example of how to engage in political discourse. The progressive New York Times opinion writer Ezra Klein says that Charlie Kirk was practicing politics the right way. Conservative House Speaker Mike Johnson this week put it this way.
He never shied away from debate, but he did it in the right spirit, and I think that's what we've got to get back to. You know, it wasn't personal.
So on this show, I focus on the impact that big stories have on communities of color, right? And the perspective from communities of color on those stories. And through that lens, there's part of the conversation that we have not had on air. Many of the arguments that Kirk made in those conversations were hurtful to people of color, Black people in particular. So we'll try to unpack that and have that conversation here as we talk about how to move forward. Joining us this morning, the former district attorney for DeKalb County, Georgia, Robert James, conservative commentator, and Republican Georgia Election Board member Janelle King, and Renee Hall. She's the president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, or NOBLE. Thank you so much, all of you, for being with me. And let me start with you, Robert. What are you expecting as potentially additional charges, and do you see federal charges on the way?
Well, federal charges are possible, but typically when you have a murder case, it's prosecuted by the local DA. That's the low-hanging fruit. The state legislature has passed statutes. Anytime the federal government gets involved, there has to be jurisdiction, so they don't automatically have jurisdiction when a crime is committed. So it's going to have to come under some sort of crime that, you know, engages interstate commerce that gives the federal government a stake in the claim.
Do you think this is ripe for a death penalty case?
I would not be surprised if the local prosecutor's office sought the death penalty. Yeah. I would not be, but I think you really sort of have to reserve your opinion on that until you hear more facts. You know, whether this individual was mentally ill, you know, what was going on in his head, what was his motivation. You know, clearly it's a murder if it's proven, right? Yeah. But when you start getting into death penalty, you start looking at the circumstances around the murder and why the murder took place.
And so many of those questions, obviously at this point in the investigation, do not have answers, and sources say that Robinson is not speaking with investigators. Let me come to you, because this was an assassination at an outdoor venue. We remember last July the attempt on the life of President Trump at an outdoor venue. As former law enforcement, former chief as well, are these places that these rallies can happen in the future? How does you secure these moving forward?
Well, that's a great question, Victor. And I think first we need to start with the fact that political violence cannot be the language of disagreement. When we look at where these places are held, Charlie Kirk was not an elected official. He was an individual who was a voice in the community. So the security around those venues were different than if it were a congressman or a president of the United States. So what we have to focus on is what is the climate at the time of the individuals who are speaking or who are going to be present at these locations. There needs to be a security assessment done around those particular individuals. Usually that happens if that is an elected official. Because he was not, those security measures were not in place, and it was basic for a college campus. And this is why the individual had the opportunity to commit this heinous act.
Janelle, talk to me about climate. You, as I said, Georgia Elections Board 2024, you all tried to make some changes to rules before the election. What was that like? Did you receive threats as a conservative Black woman? I'd imagine that you stand out. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about the reality.
Yeah, you know, it's really hard watching this. You know, if you know Charlie, you know that he is someone who pushed values. And the thing about it is, us being a conservative voice in this world, unfortunately, it feels like death threats just comes with the territory. I've gotten them. My friends have gotten them. I'm pretty sure by the end of the day, I may have more. The fact of the matter is we've gotten to a point where we're beyond red or blue. This is not about Republican or Democrat. This, in my opinion, is about emotional maturity or the lack thereof. If you can't look at someone, disagree with them, and still be able to have a conversation, still be able to operate with common decency, then that's a bigger problem. And one of the things that I like to point out is that being a person of faith is something that Charlie always talked about. You've had conversations. I know my husband and I have had conversations about what happens if this was to happen to one of us. The fact of the matter is we do rely on our faith. We do understand that in this world there will be challenges, there will be tribulations, but you have to fight, and we know that God has overcome it all. And so we know that this is not our final resting place, and we take joy and comfort in knowing that Charlie, along with others, will be with Christ.
I want to just get into this element of several conservatives now holding him up as the example of the way that political discourse should happen in this country. And so let me play a bit of the Charlie Kirk show, and then we'll talk.
If I see a black pilot, I'm going to be like, boy, I hope he's qualified. Happening all the time in urban America. Prowling blacks go around for fun to go target white people. That's a fact. It's happening more and more. If we would have said that Joy Reid and Michelle Obama and Sheila Jackson Lee and Ketanji Brown Jackson were affirmative action picks, we would have been called the racist. But now they're coming out and they're saying it for us. You do not have the brain processing power to otherwise be taken really seriously. You had to go steal a white person's slot to go be taken somewhat seriously.
And so, Janelle, I wonder what you say to people who say that, you know, they condemn the shooting, they condemn political violence, and Charlie Kirk is not an example of how political discourse should move forward in this country. What do you say to that?
Yeah, you know, I think unlike most people, I've seen the full extent of those conversations, and I understand where it was coming from a different perspective. However, what I think we have to point out is that this is not about individual perspective. This is about having a perspective overall. Irregardless of whether or not you agree or disagree with what he's saying, it's the fact that you can agree and disagree with what he's saying. So at the end of it all, I think that what we're propping up is that he's someone who encouraged you to have your perspective, even if there's disagreement there. So we have to continue to do that. I want to hear more from people who don't agree or do not share the same views that I share. I like having those conversations. I feel like that's what makes America America. So I think what we need to make clear is that what we're propping up as conservatives is that there needs to be more healthy discourse in this country.
Renee, Senator Ruben Gallego was supposed to have a town hall, but he canceled it out of an abundance of caution. You speak with law enforcement executives across the country. Help us understand the climate right now, the intensity across the U.S.
So when you look across the country at this level of violence, what we recognize is that this murder is not about Charlie Kirk. This is what happens when divisiveness and hate is left unchecked. And so what we are in law enforcement working to do in communities, and especially in communities of color where we see that Charlie Kirk really spoke against on a number of occasions, is that we're trying to speak to our communities and calm the community, calm the conversation, because we're not getting that from the highest level in this office. And so we know that there are some conversations that need to be had, some really tough conversations about hate-fueled violence in this country, about individuals having their own opinion. I agree with Janelle 100%. We should be able to agree without being disagreeable, but we also need to understand that there are consequences to hate speech. There's consequences for individuals to continue to push a narrative that promotes violence in this country.
And I want to make sure, because people are going to hear you say that there are consequences to hate speech, I want to give you an opportunity to separate those consequences from what happened to Charlie Kirk last week. You're not drawing a connection between those two.
I am not drawing a connection between violence, the level of violence, but individuals feel very passionate about that, and no one should lose their life because of this. But when we continue as a country to push this hate-fueled speech and this rhetoric, we're seeing the violence happen regardless to whether you're red and blue. And what are we going to do about it? In Black communities, we recognize that historically, church bombings, the assassination of our political leaders in Black communities, that should not be a blueprint. It should be a warning that we need to do something different in this country.